Slavery has taken many forms throughout human history, from the forced labor of ancient Egypt and the systematic servitude in Carthage to the transatlantic slave trade. The reduction of human beings to property has been a recurring, tragic feature in almost every society. Until the 19th century, nearly every culture maintained its own system of slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, more than a European story. Perhaps no system has stirred as much moral outrage as the transatlantic slave trade. European nations built vast networks to supply labor for their American colonies, with an estimated 12 million Africans forcibly transported across the Atlantic. Yet, while European colonizers are often depicted as the sole perpetrators of this atrocity, the reality is more complex. Many Africans actively participated in the trade as victims, intermediaries, and even profiteers, helping to create and maintain systems that spanned local politics and economies. Unraveling the African slave trade long before Europeans sailed the Atlantic, slavery was integral to African societies. In ancient Egypt, slaves labored on monumental projects. In Carthage, they were commodities traded across the Mediterranean, and Ethiopian kings proudly recorded their victories by tallying the captives they made. Beyond these early examples, two major trade networks had been operating for centuries. The Trans-Saharan trade. Lasting over 1,000 years, this system moved roughly 10 million people across harsh deserts to work as laborers in the Islamic world. The Indian Ocean trade. In a similar tradition, about 5 million individuals were transported to serve as domestic workers, soldiers, or in other capacities, sometimes undergoing brutal treatments like castration. However, our focus is on West Africa, the heartland of the Atlantic slave trade. Relatively isolated from the Indian Ocean routes and early Islamic raids, West African societies had developed intricate slave systems long before European ships appeared on their shores. The rise of West African empires and their slave systems. In West Africa, powerful empires such as Ghana and Mali emerged between the 3rd and 13th centuries. These kingdoms built their wealth on multiple fronts. Not only did they control the trans-Saharan exchange of valuable goods like salt, gold, and copper, but they also depended on slave labor. In the Mali Empire, for instance, rulers like Mansa Musa amassed enormous fortunes, partly thanks to the labor of enslaved peoples. Elite households even imported female slaves from the Mediterranean to serve as domestic help. In these societies, slaves were captured in warfare against neighboring groups and became both an economic resource and a symbol of status. Successor states like the Jolof and Kabu continued and expanded these systems. For these empires, slave ownership was not merely an economic necessity, but also a marker of political power and social prestige. European contact and the shifting landscape. When Portuguese explorers began their contact with West Africa in the mid-15th century, the established local slave systems underwent significant changes. Initially, the Portuguese took slaves to Europe. However, by 1526, they had begun transporting Africans directly to the Americas. Contrary to the familiar image of European raiders forcefully abducting individuals, most slaves entered the transatlantic trade through transactions negotiated by local African rulers. The collapse of mighty states like Mali led to a political vacuum. Splinter kingdoms, eager to gain an advantage, accepted European firearms in exchange for the plentiful captives their internal conflicts produced. Kingdoms such as Congo and various Akan states along the Gold Coast became deeply involved in this new economic model. Notably, King Afonso I of Congo not only traded thousands of slaves annually, but also worked to institute legal guidelines aimed at protecting his subjects from the worst abuses of the trade. Case study: Dahomey, a kingdom built on slavery. Among the most infamous slaving states was the Kingdom of Dahomey, which emerged around 1600 along what is now southern Nigeria. Dahomey built a formidable military force, reportedly reaching up to 50,000 men, sustained largely by constant slave raids. In Dahomey, enslaved people filled many roles. They tilled the land, mined precious metals, served as soldiers, and even acted as political advisors. Ownership of slaves signified wealth and status. Moreover, slavery was woven into the very fabric of Dahomean culture, with rituals, festivals, and royal funerals that sometimes involved the sacrifice of hundreds or thousands of captives. Even as abolitionist sentiments grew in Europe, Dahomey initially resisted change. Under mounting British pressure in 1818, concessions were made, such as ending ritual slave sacrifices, yet loopholes allowed the trade to continue until the kingdom's economy finally collapsed and European forces conquered it in 1894. European abolitionism and its aftermath. A common misconception is that European imperialism in Africa was solely driven by a hunger for more slaves. In truth, while some colonies, for example in Angola, supplied significant numbers of slaves, much of European colonization occurred after the slave trade that had been abolished. In many cases, anti-slavery ideals provided the moral justification for European intervention. For example, the British Navy's bombardment of Lagos in 1851 forced local leaders to end the trade, liberating countless enslaved people. Similarly, British forces attacked Benin City in 1897, partly because of its continued reliance on slavery. A complex legacy. The suffering inflicted by the Transatlantic and other slave trades is indisputable. Yet the history of slavery in Africa is not a simple story of passive victimhood. African societies, from small communities to vast empires, were both complicit in and resistant to these systems. Recognizing this complexity is essential. It does not lessen the cruelty of slavery. Rather, it offers a more complete understanding of the economic, political, and cultural forces that shaped the continent's history. Acknowledging Africa's dual role as both victim and perpetrator brings us closer to an honest account of this shared human tragedy. Conclusion. In summary, the history of slavery in Africa is as multifaceted as it is tragic. Powerful West African empires built their wealth on systems of slavery long before European contact. When the transatlantic slave trade emerged, African societies were already deeply enmeshed in a network of slave trading, which Europeans exploited to establish a vast, brutal system. European abolitionism and subsequent colonial interventions further complicated this legacy. By understanding these layers, the indigenous practices, the external exploitation, and the eventual fight against slavery, we gain a clearer view of a history marked by both profound suffering and remarkable resilience.